And with a lot of goodwill, this problem could be addressed. And if it is addressed, if you can really build a Pacific-wide trade zone over, say, the next 10 to 20 years, that'll make a huge difference in the world. It will not solve all of the world's problems. We're going to have a lot of problems to solve over the next 10 to 20 years. But a cooperative, positive-sum regime in international trade and economic cooperation in that region will make all of the problems much easier to solve in the world than before. And by the way, I suspect that if you get there, if you do get to a Pacific-wide free trade area, the next step of bringing Europe in will not be that hard, because the incentives will be very strong by that time to return essentially to the global track. So as we have veered off from the global track, this provides ultimately a road back to it. So what kind of agreement should this be? One of the arguments that the negotiators stress is that it has to be innovative, it has to be forward-looking, it has to be looking at the 21st century. My next slide, I give some idea of what they might have in mind. It certainly means dealing with new issues such as services, trade facilitation, and so on. Give some more example of that later. And it has to be dynamic in the sense that it has to lead to this endpoint. It has to be a pathway that leads to the FTAP in the end to make the agreement itself worthwhile, to make the whole project worthwhile. Its current scale and its near future scale is not likely to make it worthwhile. It's this pathway that makes it worthwhile. It has to be attractive to the US because it will have to be sold under difficult conditions in the US Congress. And it has to be attractive to partners. Because it won't achieve this pathway function unless it is. Now, all this raises tensions, and here is where I think really the big issue is in the TPP is how high to set the bar. You can set the bar very high, and in fact, if you look at the incentives facing negotiators, they want to set the bar high. They want to come up with a better agreement than the last group did. They want to invent new areas which they can say they pioneered, and I've sort of now spent some time talking to these people, very bright people, very energetic, very knowledgeable, and they want to leave a mark on the landscape of trade negotiations, and the way to do that is by making a more sophisticated and a more interesting agreement. Now, what that exactly means is difficult to say. For example, in the case of intellectual property rights. You want to make sure that if you are an American negotiator, you want to make sure that American pharmaceuticals are not discriminated against in the healthcare systems of other countries. But in New Zealand, they have a system in which people for a particular disease are given funding to buy a certain value drug. You can get access to other drugs, but then you will pay the difference between the level that they finance and the cost of the drug. Now, often the New Zealand administration, the health administration, picks a relatively low price at which to compensate in order to save on healthcare costs, and the American patented drug goes at a very high price. Now, what in effect the American negotiators have been told to do by the American pharmaceutical companies is to try to get rid of New Zealand's right to create reimbursement methods like this, because they implicitly discriminate against high-priced American pharmaceuticals. Now, think about what that means. That, I mean, is really a very deep level of intervention, and that's what they're negotiating about. I don't know how it's going to come out. But is that high standard, or is that a standard which really ought not to be entering the trade negotiation? So anyway, the problem is that a lot of what negotiation is about now are these very complicated and very advanced rules, which maybe with other countries which have a great stake in intellectual property rights protection, maybe with them we can agree to. But there's no way, if we agree with them, that we will be able to bring in Indonesia or China into this agreement 5 years down the road. So this is, I think, what's at stake. One wants to set the bar very high, but not so high as to prevent the agreement from ultimately expanding. The way I like to think about it is we want to set the bar so high that China can't make it now, but will want to make it in 2026. So that by then we have, in effect, a feasible path for moving forward for a larger agreement. Now, let me turn very briefly. This is what 21st century means. On the left-hand side, what you see are all the chapters in agreements that have been in the 37 that have been concluded so far. 100% of those agreements have a goods chapter. 94% have a rules of origin chapter, and so on. So most of what you see on the left-hand side are what current agreements have in them. On the right-hand side are the proposed chapters around which negotiations are now going on. And as you can see, many of them have not appeared in any of the agreements so far. For example, science and technology, culture, logistics have not appeared in any. SMEs, primary industry, safety standards, environment have appeared in very few. So this is where some of this 21st century is. And the concern here is to make sure that the rules that we come up with are rules that ultimately many countries will want to follow, not just a handful of those with the most sophisticated economic policymakers. Our study, essentially we do two things. We use this model, which in fact is the same model that Michael referred to earlier, which we use to analyze the ASEAN integration efforts. It's a very broad CGE model. It includes a series of effects from modern trade theory, such as heterogeneous firms, and addresses services investment, so it tends to generate larger effects than you tend to see in most CGE models. And we use it to explore the dynamic path. That is, we use it to explore what will happen to countries as the agreements around them begin to take shape, and how that will change their incentives to join one or another grouping which begins to form. And I will give you, at this point, just a very quick graph and some of the early results. We don't yet have full results. We hope to have them in a couple of months. Here is a case of the United States. The red line, the blue line here is if nothing happens. If we're stuck at today's, the middle line is if we're stuck at today's set of international agreements. The red line is what if the ASEAN Plus agreements move forward, ultimately including China, Japan, and Korea in the ASEAN +3, or possibly even a CEPIA, which includes Australia, New Zealand, and India. What if those